In this lecture, we'll talk about variables, the isThat function, superglobal variables, and functions. Before we get started with variables, I have decided to use the template that I created in the last assignment. So this is it. I just changed the title to Cool Site. I took my hobbies link and made it back to my links page, and I also created this assignments link and put it in. I changed the header to say Cool Site. So now this is what my site looks like, and I have this assignments link right here, and as you can see, it's a page with a link to my variables right there, and this is the code that produces it. I include my header, my footer, and then I just need to put the links to all of my assignments. So as I do more and more assignments, I could just put the link to them right here. So when you do your assignments, you can have the same setup, having one page that links to all of your other assignments that you'll do. Now this is my variables page right here. As you can see, I've included my header and my footer, and I can click on the link for my assignments to my variables page, and this is what we get. And this is where we'll be working for most of the rest of the lectures on this page. And I'm going to cover variables fairly quickly because I've assumed that you've programmed before, and we also talked about this a little bit in the first lecture. Variables start with a $sign, and then they have letters and numbers following it. A valid variable name will always start with a letter. We can't start it with a number. It always has to start with a letter A through Z. So after we have one letter, then we can start adding numbers and underscores and other characters. Not a question mark though, but we can add other characters to be part of the variable name. And that's fairly common in most programming languages. And variables can be strings, and variables can be numbers. Maybe I'll say a num bar and a string bar right there. And we can also have booleans as well, and we can set those to true and false. And again, if you remember from the conditional lecture that numbers, that anything that's not 0 is a true value, so it could be interpreted as a boolean, and anything that's a 0 will be false. So a number can also be true or false. And one way to check to see if a variable is set is just to do if the name of the variable. So if I go if numbar, of course, if it's non-zero, then it will return true. But if we have a string right here, if we haven't ever used it before, so if we do a string bar right here, this will return true. Right there. But if I do an if my string var, which I haven't defined before, so I'm printing out here and not here, right there. And notice I just get the here, and we don't get in here because my string var is undefined. So all undefined variables, when used as a boolean in an if statement, will return false, so we won't get in there. So this seems like a good way to check to see if something's defined or not. Now I know it might seem a little weird that we're checking to see if something's defined, when we can just look up here and see if they're defined. But sometimes these variables, we set them from values from the query string, or we set them from when a user fills in some form on a form and they click submit, and we're looking at these variables. Sometimes we don't know whether they submitted them or not, and we want to check to see if they're defined or not. So this seems like a good way, but the problem is if we have a string variable that's blank right here, and if we look what happens, we can see that the here doesn't come in here. So empty strings are a false value. And also for numbers, if here num is defined right here. Let me include that. If we look here, we can see, well, the number is defined, but what happens if the number is defined but it's 0? Like I say, 0 values or false values right here. So, and that's the same thing with a boolvar variable. If it was set to false, we wouldn't know if it was undefined or if it was false. So there is a function to do that, and that function is called isSet. So let me return this to a string right here, and this to a 5, and we can just use the isSet function right here. And if you notice, I'm calling this a function because this is something that I called a built-in function, or it's a function that somebody else has written for you, and it's just built into the language. So we can use this isSet. There's no space. It is 2 words, isSet, but there's no space. And now we can see that we have num is defined. Of course, we're getting in here as well. So isSet is a good way to check to see if something is defined or not, even though it could be a false value up here. It's still defined, but it's false. So, it's a false value, but it's still defined. So if we want to check to see if something is defined or not, isSet is the function to use for that. Okay, now we're going to talk about superglobal variables. And superglobal variables are variables that we have not defined ourselves. To understand the name superglobal variables, we also have to understand what global variables are. And these are global variables right here, because once we define them, we can use them anywhere. After they've been defined, we can use them and we'll get their values out. So we can use these 3 variables anywhere else for the rest of our PHP script. So global kind of means we can use it anywhere inside of the file. And there are variables that are not global. When we learn about functions later in this lecture, when we define a variable inside of a function, we can only use that variable in the function. So that's a non-global variable. It's just a local variable for a function. So superglobal variables mean that they're defined before we even get into our script. And we've used them before. The one that we've used before is the $_get. And this is a superglobal variable that has basically given us a way to get variables out of the query string. Notice we didn't define this anywhere. We didn't define it in the header.php. It's just given to us, so that's why we call it a superglobal variable. And it's also an array. So we'll talk about arrays in another lecture, but if you remember, arrays have these square brackets on them. It's an associative array, which is kind of a special array, but we'll talk more about that later. But we haven't defined this right here, but we can use isSet with this to be able to to see if somebody has set their name in the query string or not. So I'm going to snap my fingers and insert some code. Okay, so you can see we have this isSet function right here. So if they've set their name, we'll welcome them. If not, then we'll print out some instructions on how to get their name and get their welcome. And so we could see the instructions right here, and then we could put our name equals Jerry, and now we can see the welcome Jerry. So this isSet is trying to see if it's defined. Now somebody might have set their name, but set their name to nothing, and we still get the welcome. See how that if we were just saying if without the isSet, then it would give us more instructions. So that might be what you want, but in other instances you might want to print out something even if they leave it blank. So that's a good use of the isSet, and it also talks about the superglobal variable $_get. Now I'm gonna snap my fingers and insert some other superglobal variables that you should know about. Okay, so the stuff that I added is all of this, and $_server is another superglobal variable. It's also another associative array, which we'll talk about later on, and it works a lot like get. But these are some variables that get sent along with the request for a PHP page that you can use to help you design maybe a better page or to keep statistics. And two of them that you should know about, two of the variables inside of this server, or items inside of it, is the HTTP referrer, and this is misspelled. There should be two R's in that, but whoever came up with the standard didn't spell it right, so it's always missing an R right here. And the referrer helps you keep a log of how people got to your website. So if someone was on Google and they clicked on a link that went to your website, you'd be able to see what page they were on and what page they were on to be able to get to your website. So you can record this in a log and see how people arrive at your website and keep statistics that way. Now, you can't use this for security measures at all. You might be tempted to use this to make sure that people submit a form that you've seen, because this is set by the browser. The browser is the one that knows what page you're on, and when you click on a link, the browser knows, sends the page that you're on as the referrer to the page that you're going to. So this is up to the web browser to send it, and people can disable the web browser from sending this information as well. So as you can see, I am using isSet to check to make sure it's set. And then we also have the user agent, and this tells you the computer and browser you're using. So let's look and see this. As you can tell, we can see the user agent right here, but the HTTP referrer is not there. Well, that's because I came up here and I typed name equals Jerry and I pressed enter. So there was no page with a link on it that I clicked on to get to this page. So if we want to see it, I'm going to go back to my assignments page, click on my variables page, and there it is. So I now know that this user, which is me, but that he got to this page by clicking on a link that was on assignments.php. So that's the HTTP referrer and the user agent. Now there are a lot more superglobal variables and a lot more stuff to know about variables. This is just a brief overview, and I encourage you to check out some of the links that I've linked to in the textbook down below. Now this is just going to be a very brief overview of functions in PHP. Now there have been some predefined or built-in functions that you have seen, like the isSet function, and we'll talk about more of these in some other videos. But there are also user-defined functions, and I'm assuming you've seen this before and that you've written your own functions. But a user-defined function in PHP starts out with the word function and then a name, maybe my function, and then any variables that you want to take in. Now if you're used to Java, you're used to putting what type of variable, like an integer or a boolean or something like that. We don't have that in PHP, so we can just put it in here, my function, there's a number, and we can print maybe right here. And functions can also return values. They could return booleans, numbers, strings right here. So this is a function that returns a string right here and takes in one parameter, and hopefully it's a number. There's no way to really check to make sure it is a number, and then it'll print out the number is, and then it will return a string to print later. So this is a function definition, and later on we can call it. So usually most function definitions will go into the very top of your page right here if you're just going to use it on that page. A lot of times when you write a function you want to use it on more than one page. So you usually put it in a file that you include. So we'll usually have a file, and it might be all of our functions or included functions or something like that. And inside of that file are all of your function definitions right there. And then you include it in, and then your functions are defined, and then you can use them here. So just for now, imagine that I defined this function in a separate file and included it in up here. That's the way you should do it. I'm just going to leave it all in one file since this is just a quick demonstration on how it works. Okay, and later on we can get a string variable set equal to my function and pass in 10 right here. And then we'll print, put a line break before it, and we'll print a string out. And then we'll do this again, so now we can call the function several times, more than once if we want to. So we can have a b string as well and print that out. Okay, and we'll see how this works, and see we call the function twice, and then we have the string to print out later, and then we print out the number is 10, and string to print out later. Of course, we could pass in a different value here, like 5, and now we have that there. So hopefully you've seen functions before. And do you remember when I was talking about superglobal variables and I talked about scopes? If I use a variable here called my new var equals 20, and we can put that in here, my new var right there. So we can use this inside of the function because we defined it inside of the function, but we can't use my new var down below. If I go if is set let's print out here some exclamation marks, and then here we'll print out undefined here. And so we can see that we define a variable inside of the function, and now we'll see outside of the function the variable should not be defined because its scope has been limited to just inside of in here. So this is just a local variable as opposed to a global variable that we defined outside of any function. And so now we have superglobal variables are defined before we even start our PHP. Global variables are any variable that we define. Local variables are variables that we define inside of a function, and they can only be accessed inside of a function. So we'll see that this is undefined. I need to put a semicolon right there, and then we'll see that we have an undefined instead of a here. So this is again just a brief summary of functions, and I encourage you to refer to the textbook links to read some more about functions. Hopefully you've seen them before. If you feel like you need more practice, then definitely look for some more help with functions.